Welcome to the Harvard Art Museums and tonight's lecture, Animal-Shaped Vessels from the Ancient World, Contexts and Meanings. My name is Daniel Rosenblatt, and I am a junior in Pforzheimer House and concentrating in history and literature. I'm a member of the Harvard Art Museum Student Board and am delighted to welcome you all here on behalf of our student community. Please now be sure to turn off your cell phones and help me to warmly welcome Susanna Ebbinghaus, George M.A. Hanfman Curator of Ancient Art, who will introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Daniel, and good evening and welcome to the lecture Animal-Shaped Vessels from the Ancient World, Contexts and Meanings. After exploring the social roles of alcohol and feasting for our opening light lecture, the focus of this evening's lecture will be on the archaeological context, especially of Bronze Age vessels, and on animals. Why animals and why these particular ones? Support for tonight's lecture is provided by the M. Victor Leventritt Fund, which was established through the generosity of the wife, children, and friends of the late M. Victor Leventritt, Harvard class of 1935. The purpose of the fund is to present outstanding scholars of the history and theory of art to the Harvard and Greater Boston communities. I'm very grateful that Kimberly Patton and Robert Koehl could make time in their busy schedules to speak to us tonight. Both wrote for the exhibition catalog. Professor Koehl contributed the early history of animal-shaped vessels in the Stone and Bronze Ages, and Professor Patton explored the vital importance of animals and their representations to us human animals. Tonight's lecture will combine both perspectives, that of the archaeologist and that of the scholar of religion. Each presentation will last about 20 minutes, then we will sit down for a panel discussion and also invite questions from you. And after the lecture, the exhibition galleries will be open until 8 p.m. Our first speaker is Robert Koehl. He's a professor in and currently also the chair of the Department of Classical and Oriental Studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. Professor Koehl is a specialist on the Aegean Bronze Age with a long-standing interest in animal-shaped vessel and Reiter flowing vessels. And with long-standing, I mean that his interest goes back to the fall semester of his freshman year at Pomona College and the course on Greek art and archaeology he took then. Aegean Reiter were the focus of his dissertation research at the University of Pennsylvania, although he ultimately received his PhD for a different study on the Aegean and Cypriot ceramics from Sarepta in Lebanon. This research was published in 1985 as Sarepta Volume 3, the Imported Bronze and Iron Age Wares, the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania Excavations at Sarafund. Professor Koehl's research on Aegean Reiter, animal-shaped, but also of other non-animal shapes, such as conical, grew into the 2006 monograph Aegean Bronze Age Reiter. This book is a monumental work of scholarship comprising some 480 pages of text and another 150 pages of tables, figures, and plates, and including descriptions and drawings of over 1,300 Reiter. Such an exhaustive treatment of a class of material is quite rare in archaeology, and it actually allows us to draw well-founded conclusions, some of which we will hear tonight. Professor Koehl has been involved in numerous fieldwork projects in Greece and Turkey and is currently preparing a publication of the Mycenaean pottery excavated at the site of Koukounarias on the Greek island of Paros. So please join me in welcoming Professor Koehl.
Well, I must begin, of course, by thanking Suzanne Ebbinghaus for creating this magnificent show and inviting me to contribute to the volume accompanying the exhibition, and for giving me the chance to share my thoughts on these vases with you this evening. I'm sure that by now all of you have reacted to these wonderful vases with at least a sense of delight in their visual brilliance, but surely too with curiosity and questions. Indeed, their mere existence seems to elicit a host of questions ranging from the physical to the metaphysical. On the latter, you hear more from my colleague, Professor Patton. But surely we would all like to know how they were used, when they were used, and perhaps most elusively, why. Though I certainly am unable to answer all of the issues these vases raise, I think that examining them from a variety of perspectives yields insights which only enhance the sensual pleasures we've already experienced in viewing them. Let's start at the beginning, with the site of Bukras, near the Euphrates River in Syria. Oh, I'm not even going to try in pointing it out. Where perhaps the earliest cluster of zoomorphic vessels has been found. Dating to the later years of the 7th millennium, during the Neolithic era, Bukras was a village of herders whose diet, according to the organic remains from the site, was largely dependent on animals, rather than the rapidly developing agriculture-based society emerging elsewhere in the region. 3 zoomorphic vessels were carved from gypsum were found together in a building along with large numbers of cups, bowls, and jugs in what might be identified as a communal pantry. Thus, from their context, it may be surmised that these vases were used in a communal dining activity, an occasion which, based on the quantities of animal bones, might even be characterized as a feast. Measuring about 7 inches in length, they would seem capable of holding a fair amount, certainly more than any of the cups and bowls. One feature that I find worth noting is the opening on their backs, which is also quite large. Indeed, as they are surrounded by a low rim, I imagine that they could have been drunk from directly. We see a similar morphology on zoomorphic vases from Hajalar, a Middle Neolithic site in south-central Turkey. I think it is reasonable to assume that if these zoomorphic vessels were present at communal feasts, then they held a special status. Certainly their quality and rarity are suggestive. But what did they contain? Since viticulture was in its early stages, perhaps a type of wine was consumed, though only residue analyses could confirm this. Or perhaps they contained the blood of the animals that they depict, although I tend to doubt that. I wonder if they were trophies awarded to the best hunters. Alternatively, they might have been passed around for the pleasure and benefit of those who were in attendance. But why choose to drink from an animal-shaped vase when there are any number of more practical ways of consuming fluids? What was to be gained? When I began thinking about this group of vases for the chapter that I contributed to the volume for this show, I speculated that by drinking from an animal-shaped vase, the consumer would absorb the characteristics of that animal which humans admired and sought to gain. Thus, the hare might represent speed and the bull fertility. But what about the hedgehog? Indeed, besides the bull, the hedgehog has the longest and most continuous history and the broadest distribution of any species of zoomorphic vase. Frankly, there are any number of biological and behavioral traits which the hedgehog possesses that humans might covet, including their longevity, with a lifespan often exceeding 12 years. They're also fertile. Female hedgehogs give birth 3 times a year. Mothers feed grapes to their young by rolling against grapevines, thereby skewering the grapes on their quills. Furthermore, to this day, farmers on Crete predict the duration of the winter based on the hibernation patterns of hedgehogs, who respond to mild winters with shorter sleep. Humans would also appreciate how hedgehogs kill poisonous snakes. The poisonous snake coils itself around the hedgehog and performs a kind of harikari by tightening itself around the hedgehog, thereby piercing itself with its quills. During the 5th and 4th millennia, great changes occurred in the Near East, especially in the realm of technologies. This era, known as the Chalcolithic, literally copper and stone, witnessed great advances in metallurgy and agriculture. Sometimes called the secondary products revolution, raw materials such as milk were now transformed into new products such as butter or cheese, using a new vase shape for a churn. One of the most inventive centers of culture at this time was in the southern Levant, present-day Israel, where a people known to archaeologists as the Gasulians, after the type site of Tulelat el Gasul, flourished from the Golan in the north to Beersheba in the south. A pair of vases was found in one of their cult sites at Gilat, outside of Tel Aviv. The female vase holds a churn vessel on her head, which, like the Neolithic vessels we've been examining, also has a rather large opening at the top, making her suitable as a drinking vessel. But what about her companion, the ram? The ram also carries 3 vessels on its back, which resemble another Gasulian shape known as the cornet. These are regarded as a kind of drinking vessel, most likely for fermented beverages. In all honesty, I have no good explanation for how the ram vessel functioned, specifically how it was emptied. Tipping it over to pour out its contents would have been messy and lacking in focus, and rituals need a focal point. Possible clues to the functioning of this vessel may be found looking further east to southern Mesopotamia. During the later 4th millennium, cities were emerging here with vast religious precincts dominated by monumental temples. At the site of Kafaja, ancient Tutub, large terracotta bull and bird-shaped vessels were found in 2 of its temples. What appears to be a new feature on them is the raised spout on their backs and the opening through the beak or muzzle. We see the same kind of spout on the animal vases depicted on the contemporary Warka vase from Uruk and on a contemporary cylinder seal, though it's not possible to tell if their snouts were open. Texts from the Middle and Late Bronze Age call these zoomorphic vases by a generic term, bibru, an Akkadian word that originally meant bird. Furthermore, Hittite texts state that the bibru was a drinking vessel for the gods, which might explain why they appear among Inanna's cult equipment on the Warka vase. I think it's also worth noting that this is one of the rare instances where texts can be linked to an archaeologically attested artifact class. While the lifespan of the bibru stretches from the late 4th millennium to the late 2nd millennium, there appears to be a gap in the archaeological record in Mesopotamia during the early dynastic 1 and 2 periods, when Sumerian culture may be said to have reached its high point. I wonder if this apparent gap reflects the status, according to the bibru, as drinking vessels for the gods, or their royal avatars. Perhaps in early dynastic 1 and 2, they were made exclusively in silver or gold, which texts inform us were used for cult equipment and hence have not survived. But by the early dynastic 3 period, they reappear as large clay bull and ram-shaped vases, often equipped with wheels. The best evidence to explain the function of the bibru may come from Middle Bronze Age Anatolia. At Kultepe, ancient Kanesh, in Cappadocia, the bibru is an important component in the domestic assemblages of the Assyrian merchants who living there, where they are normally found in the owner's archive room. Thus, what was once a vessel privileged to gods and their impersonators was adopted here for the private sphere. Furthermore, the discovery of bibrus with sets of cups, jugs, and occasionally animal-shaped cups, about which we'll say more shortly, and their pristine state of preservation has suggested to the excavators that these vases were used for domestic rituals, but only on special occasions. Like the late Uruk bird vase, these bibrus have a raised spout on their back and another opening, discreetly placed in the nostrils or muzzle. The presence of this smaller secondary opening is usually explained as a libation channel, and hence the general interpretation that these bibrus were libation vessels. However, these holes are very small, and not all are placed in the front. Sometimes the hole is placed in the animal's rump. Since texts consistently regard the bibru as a drinking vessel, I prefer to regard them as firing holes. Air could thus circulate through the vessel while it was in the kiln to prevent it from cracking or exploding. In fact, there's very good iconographic and corresponding physical evidence which indicates that from the Middle to Late Bronze Age, libations were poured from narrow-necked jugs with elongated spouts, not zoomorphic vessels. Beginning in the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia and continuing into Middle Bronze Age Anatolia, seals depict people drinking in groups or individually from long tubes inserted into the necks of vases. I think that explains how the bibru was used as a drinking vessel. In fact, a bronze drinking tube was recently discovered at Kultepe. You see it right there. The only silver bibru to survive is the stag-shaped vase from Shaft Grave 5 at Mycenae, which may have arrived as a gift from a Hittite king to a Mycenaean. Like its ceramic counterparts, the silver bibru has a raised spout. But please observe that the hole in its muzzle only pierces the nostril, and thus could not be a channel for libations. I must mention here that I first gave serious thought to this vase when I was invited to contribute to a festschrift for the late, great, and legendary Emily Vermeulen, whom I suspect many of you knew or at least know of. I'm especially glad that one of the co-editors of this volume, Jane Carter, who is now editor of the American Journal of Archaeology, is with us this evening. Since I wrote the piece, the silver has been reanalyzed and matches well with sources in the Taurus Mountains. The Mycenaean who received this Anatolian silver bibru was surely familiar with the existence of zoomorphic vases. This same grave contained the only other precious metal zoomorphic vases known from the Aegean, the splendid silver bull and gold lion's heads. And these are some of the other vases found in that same grave, a lot of Raita. Whereas the function of the small secondary opening on ceramic bibrus is ambiguous, the secondary opening in the mouths of the bull and lion's head are integral to the function of this class of Aegean vases. Animal-shaped vases have a long history in the Aegean. Besides a few Neolithic ones from northern Greece, it's on Crete that we see a long and continuous tradition for making zoomorphic vases from the beginning to the end of the Bronze Age. The earliest ones are two vases from a cemetery in southern Crete and date to the early Minoan I period near the end of the 4th millennium. While the bird is quite schematic, there are more details rendered on the calf-shaped vase. Though time doesn't permit, I should mention that elsewhere I have proposed that the prototype for this calf-shaped vase was the ram vase from Gasulian Gilat. This is part of a large constellation of evidence which points to a migration from the southern Levant to Crete at the end of the Chalcolithic. I would only add that several weeks ago, the DNA analyses of bones from a Gasulian burial cave in Israel concluded that the population originally migrated from eastern Anatolia. This is compatible with DNA analyses from East Cretan burials published recently, which also pointed to an Anatolian origin of that population. Animal-shaped vases continue to be made on Crete, though mostly in the form of bird jugs. But sometime towards the end of the early Bronze Age, a new kind of zoomorphic vessel begins to appear, which since the early 20th century, archaeologists have called araiton, from the Greek verb reo, meaning to flow. The earliest ones are bulls, followed soon by birds. What they share is an opening on the animal's back, which communicates with an opening through its muzzle or beak. On bulls, this opening was first located at the tail end, but soon the handle was eliminated, and the primary opening moved up behind the bull's head. I suspect that the changes were meant to improve the manipulation of the vase, which leads to the question, how were they filled and emptied? Since scholars first became interested in these vases, it was assumed that the vases were filled from the larger opening, usually called an inlet, and liquids were then dispensed through the smaller secondary opening or outlet. It was also assumed that these vases functioned primarily for pouring libations, and with that I do not disagree. It's the question of their manipulation that has given me pause. Many years ago, as Susanna mentioned, I began a comprehensive study of all Aegean Raita that was published in 2006. Shortly after I started this study, I was working on an excavation in Crete where, as luck would have it, a room was discovered that contained a cluster of 5 intact Raita of various shapes. Here are 3 of them after cleaning. That's not one of them, the bucket-shaped vase there. This gave me the chance to experiment with filling and emptying them. And what I found was that the most efficient way of handling Raita with a narrow primary opening, like the bull vases, was to plunge them into a fluid and let it seep through the secondary opening. Once the Raiton was filled, it could be removed, and the liquid would remain inside as long as the thumb is pressed over the primary opening. Lifting the thumb up and down would thus control the flow of liquid out of the secondary opening. As a result of these experiments, I proposed that Raita could be separated into 4 distinct categories or types, based on 2 variant features: the diameter of the primary opening and the presence or absence of a base or resting surface. Regardless of its type or shape, the one constant feature on all Aegean Raita is the diameter of the secondary opening, which invariably measures a ½ centimeter. On types 1 and 2, the primary opening is small enough to be closed with the thumb or palm, whereas on types 3 and 4, the primary opening is quite wide. Furthermore, types 1 and 4 have flat bases or resting surfaces, such as the feet on zoomorphic type 1 Raita, whereas types 2 and 3 terminate in a rounded or pointed tip. As it happens, nearly all type 1 Raita are animal-shaped, and most of these are bulls. Over time, the bulls are modeled with increasing naturalism. By the second millennium, the so-called New Palace period on Crete, some of these bulls were painted white and covered with a hunting net. This raises other questions regarding the connection between these vases and hunting rituals and animal sacrifice. The association between zoomorphic rita and sacrifice may be particularly pertinent when it comes to interpreting the animal head rita. Soon after the type 1 rhyton made its appearance, a new type appeared at around 1750 during the Old Palace period. These were the heads of bulls with a wide opening at the back, a defining feature of type 3. Archaeological evidence indicates that during this period, there were particularly close ties between Crete and Anatolia. Minoans needed Anatolian metals and seemed to have exchanged them for high-quality finished goods. One byproduct of this commerce was the likely adaptation of the Anatolian zoomorphic head cup for the Minoan type 3 zoomorphic head rhyton. All it needed was a hole in its mouth. But clearly this type of rhyton would have been manipulated differently from the type 1 and 2. Actually, the single most common type of type 3 rhyton is the conical, which first appears around the same time as the bull's head, but has a longer history and wider influence. In seeking to understand how the type 3 rhyton functioned, I focused on a rhyton from Ugarit, located on the Syrian coast, which was made in a Cypriot ceramic ware. What intrigued me was the strainer attached to its mouth. Luck again intervened when a group of Egyptian-made convex conical rhyta were found at Tel Daba in the Nile Delta, along with several detachable strainers. At my request, the strainers were placed on top of the rhyta, and indeed sets of rhyta and strainers emerged. Since actual strainers are very rare in Aegean assemblages, I experimented using a tuft of wool as a filter, a common commodity in Minoan Crete. On the assumption that rhyta were used in association with fermented beverages, after placing the tuft in the rhyton, you're smiling too much at me, I'm sorry. After I sprinkled freshly ground spices on the wool and poured wine into the vase. What emerged from the tip was a clear, lightly scented and flavored wine. In other words, to borrow from the structuralists, the type 3 rhyton functioned as an agent of transition that negotiates the transformation of fluids from a raw state to a refined one. Interestingly, the lifespan of the type 3 zoomorphic head rhyton was short and had virtually disappeared by the end of the Middle Bronze Age, although type 3 conical rhyta remained common until the 13th century, or the end of the Mycenaean palatial period. What replaced the type 3 animal head was truly an ingenious creation. Starting at around 1600, a type 2 rhyton appears as an animal head set at a right angle to the neck. Like the type 1 bull, this could be filled and emptied by plunging it into a liquid, allowing it to fill through the mouth. Thus, like the type 1 bull, the flow of liquid out the mouth of the rhyton could be controlled from the primary opening, making this suitable for libations and possibly anointments. While most of their fine contexts are not very informative, the discovery of a type 2 bullhead rhyton in a small room at the Palace of Festos, called by archaeologists a lustral basin, seems clearly to place them in a ritual context. While we don't know what purpose these rooms served, the presence of the famous reed jug and a pair of horns of consecration, a stack of double axes, knives, and a human head rhyton could have comprised the equipment for various rituals. There's the human head. At some point, perhaps around 1400, many of us believe that the Mycenaeans invaded and conquered Minoan Crete, though this is not without controversy. Certainly, the Mycenaeans borrowed many aspects of Minoan material culture, including a preference for the type 3 conical rhyton. In fact, type 2 rhyta soon disappear from the archaeological record, including the animal heads. However, to the Mycenaeans may be credited the reemergence of the type 3 zoomorphic head rhyton. This was achieved by molding the popular type 3 piriform rhyton into an animal's head and adding zoomorphic features. However, what is most notable about these vessels is their distribution. Although one has been found on Naxos and several on Crete and Carpathos, All of the others of this class have been found as exports to the Levant, along with enormous quantities of Mycenaean pottery. A few other Mycenaean pottery shapes that appear in the Levant, but rarely in the Aegean, have suggested to scholars that these vases were made by Mycenaean potters specifically for export to Eastern markets. This also includes a newly imagined Type I Rhyton. But whereas during the New Palace period, the Minoan Type I Rhyton was limited to bulls, the preferred Mycenaean Type I Rhyton is the hedgehog, ingeniously made by folding a hemispherical bowl in half and adding feet and a crest and a spout on the back. Considering the history of zoomorphic vases in the Near East, and especially during the Late Bronze Age, it's no surprise that enterprising Mycenaean merchants saw a market for them and found a way to accommodate it. As we've seen by the Middle Bronze Age, zoomorphic vessels had become an important part of the ceramic assemblage in Assyrian trading colony sites, as best represented by Kultepe. Not only did these Assyrian merchants use bibrus, but also animal head-shaped cups. While the earlier ones lack a handle, which may have been the inspiration for the Minoan Type III zoomorphic head Rhyton, the later ones have a handle, which undoubtedly indicates that they were used for drinking, albeit perhaps in a ritual setting. This seems to be the beginning of a tradition for zoomorphic head cups that spreads to the northern and southern Levant, like at sites like Tel Echana and Ugarit, and to Cyprus. By the Late Bronze Age, these cups can have a handle, or as in the case of the fancier faience vessels, may lack a handle and were simply gripped at the neck. A now missing relief from 8th century Khorsabad shows how they may have been handled. As for Cyprus, not only did they have faience animal and human head vases, whose place of manufacture is still debated, but they invented a type of bull Rhyton made in the local base ring ware. In what one might characterize as a typically Late Bronze Age Cypriot response, they seem to have fused the by now defunct Minoan Type I bull Rhyton with a Mycenaean Type I or a Near Eastern bibru, providing it both with a secondary opening in the snout and a raised spout on the back. But by far the greatest variety of Late Bronze Age zoomorphic vases comes from the Hittite sphere, where the Middle Bronze Age Anatolian tradition of the bibru continues, but was joined by a greatly expanded repertoire of zoomorphic shapes. Based on the work of great Hittite scholars like Emily Vermeule's dear friend Hans Gutterbach, we know that the term bibru could be connected with other qualifying terms and the animal species or body part to designate a particular type of bibru. Thus, a bibru standing on all fours refers to the complete animal, whereas the bibru gu, or neck, refers to zoomorphic protom vases. No. Don't die now. Oh, okay. There we go. A bibru geshbu is a vase in the shape of a fist in the Boston Museum. In the Canaanite world, the term pin or face refers to zoomorphic head cups like the ones from Ugarit. Texts inform us that the Hittites elevated the status of the bibru to an object of veneration in itself, which was celebrated during a festival of the bibrus. Also, we are told that gods drank from bibrus. Certainly, besides the splendid silver bibrus, the most impressive ones that survive are the bibrus of bulls standing on all fours, which measure nearly 3 feet in height. The two best preserved ones, perhaps representing the bulls that pulled the chariot of the Hittite storm god Teshub, were found on the citadel of Hattusha, the Hittite capital city. Considering their fine context and the important religious role that the Hittite king and queen played, I feel quite certain that acting as avatars of the divine, these served as royal drinking vessels. But I think it is also improbable that they drank directly from their spout. I doubt that Queen Pudahepa lifted a 3-foot-tall bibru to her lips. Rather, I suspect that the king and queen sat beside their respective bibrus and sipped their contents through straws. Sadly, sometime near the late 13th century, the Near East and the Aegean worlds experienced upheavals which resulted in a massive wave of destructions that brought to an end nearly 2 millennia of Bronze Age palatial societies. As we see in this telling image, the collapse of these societies brought to a close the life of the Bibru and the Raiton. But soon enough, the human impulse to create animal-shaped vases revived with new forms and functions and meanings. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very rich overview, Robert. There will be plenty of time. Can you hear me? Is the microphone on? Yeah. There will be time for discussion afterwards. So we are now moving to our second talk tonight by Kimberly Patton, professor of the comparative and historical study of religion here at the Harvard Divinity School. Professor Patton specializes in ancient Greek religion and archaeology, but also teaches the history of world religions. Her involvement in different Harvard University committees shows the broad range of her interests and expertise, such as the Faculty of Arts and Sciences Committee on Degrees in Folklore and Mythology and the Committee on the Study of Religion. Professor Patton received her PhD from Harvard University with a dissertation on a topic that had long intrigued scholars, images of Greek deities pouring libations to themselves. The resulting book, Religion of the Gods, Ritual, Paradox, and Reflexivity, was published by Oxford University Press in 2009 and awarded the American Academy of Religion Award for excellence in religious studies in the analytical descriptive category. In 2006, Professor Patton published the very timely book, The Sea Can Wash Away All Evils, Modern Marine Pollution and the Ancient Cathartic Ocean, exploring the connection between modern pollution of the oceans and ancient beliefs about the sea as a purifying force. She has edited, co-edited, and written contributions for a number of collective volumes, such as A Communion of Subjects, Animals in Religion, Science, and Ethics, and the forthcoming Gemini and the Sacred, Twins and Twinship in Religion and Mythology. Animals, sacrifice, and healing sanctuaries figure prominently in her research, which often has its base in archaeology. A recent example is the article she co-authored on the burial of a pregnant woman with a full-term fetus at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük in Turkey, entitled Mother Baby, a Death in Childbirth at Çatalhöyük. The recipient of an Everett Mendelssohn Award for Excellence in Teaching in Mentoring from the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in 2016, Professor Patton also teaches actively at the Harvard Extension School and is one of the faculty members who make regular use of the Art Museum's collections in her teaching. And I would like to add that she's also a very engaged and generous member of the greater Harvard community. So welcome, Professor Patton.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and it's such an honor to be here and to have been part of this wonderful and heroic effort, this beautiful exhibition, to meet Robert Koehl and other fellow scholars in collaborating. Thank you. So I want to talk this evening about these elegant, intriguing, and idiosyncratic, and sometimes even humorous vessels that Dr. Ebbinghaus has assembled for us in animal-shaped vessels from the ancient world. They evoke, as Michael Dietler has pointed out, the ways in which drinking has been a chronic human preoccupation, as we've heard far too much about over the past week. But these vessels also challenge us to ask the other questions about human preoccupation with animals themselves. created to hold special liquids and then to dispense them, flowing out in ceremonies of drinking, pouring, libating, feasting, and gift exchange. These containers need not have been zoomorphic to work, as Professor Koehl just pointed out. Why then, over such a broad range of time and cultural location, were ancient vessels often rendered in animal form, and often fragmentary form at that, animal heads, horns, torsos, or legs? What does the animal body, represented by the artist and then used by the owner, in context we might broadly call ceremonial, add to the function of a cup or offering bowl? What does it add to its meaning? And here we have again the famous bullhead rhyton, the Minoan Neopalatial entity that we have recreated in the museum exhibit here at Harvard from the 16th to 15th century, made of precious materials, serpentinite with inlays of shell, rock crystal, and red jasper. What did it mean to pour wine or blood from the mouth of this magnificent stone bull's head during or after the sacrifice, perhaps, of a real bull in 15th century BCE Crete? For an Achaemenid Persian king at Persepolis 9 centuries later to drink from a silver vessel with the 4 parts of a ram. For an 18th century British aristocrat inspired by classical models to toast a successful hunt in Devonshire with a silver stirrup cup shaped like the frightened fox his beagles would corner, down to the bared teeth and the eyes widened in terror. Why pour liquid offerings to the gods or drink ceremonial from an artistic representation from an animal's head and not from the actual head itself? And what is imaginatively gained by adding to that animal-shaped vessel, already removed from the living beast, the extra ears, horns, antlers, wings, and beaks that often sprout from them, sometimes creating fantastic creatures? In short, why shape vessels as animals? And here we have one of the most ancient domesticated animals, the Bos indicus from the Indian subcontinent, and also represented so evocatively in the wonderful humpbacked bull, the zebu, an Iranian bull, from 1350 to 1000 BCE, terracotta, which is, again, from our exhibit lent to us from the Ashmolean. Animals have been ubiquitous characters in human lives ever since we emerged as a species sui generis, and surely long before that, too, when we were among them. Biologically classified, we Homo sapiens are ourselves animals. However, energetically, we try to draw sharp boundaries between us and them, whether in behavioral sciences, psychology, and so forth. Those barriers and classifications, as we're all aware, are crumbling every day as we learn more. It is impossible to ignore their physical analogies to our own bodies, and more uncannily, the emotions, thoughts, and consciousness that they share with us, particularly when we dwell or migrate in close quarters with them. In one sense, animals show us back our own reflections, yet at the same time, they remain powerfully other. Of the conceptual and ethical problems raised by the shocking sameness and the equally radical difference between human and non-human animals, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith observes, the problem of our kinship to other animals mirrors that of our relation to other problematic beings. Beings, that is, who are recognizably our own kind, but not yet, not quite, not just now, or no longer what we think of as what we ourselves are. Our impulses toward non-human animals have been fraught with ambivalence. We feel a deep tension, perhaps, between two yearnings, one for intimacy and communion, and the other for slaughter, consumption, and commodification. Some ritual practices, paradoxically, seem to accomplish both. This was especially true of sacrifice, as has been mentioned, whereby animals were killed and offered to the gods and feasted on, except in special cases such as the ancient Israelite Holocaust or ancient Greek offering to the underworld powers, the Sphagia. Even deep paleohistory makes clear that we hunted and ate animal victims while also venerating them, brutalized them at the same time as we domesticated them gradually, killed them en masse even as we befriended and bred them, in many cultures keeping individual animals in the most vulnerable interiors of our dwellings, decorating our walls with the dangerous parts of their wild cousins. Animals have been a source of menace as well as food in our long history, a wellspring of awe as well as an easy target for abuse. They have served as conveyors of our own identity and absorbed the projections of our worst nature. In the face of outside threat, our loyalty to them is often absolute and vice versa. Both gods and slaves in the history of religions, beasts have mediated our humanity while forcing us constantly to reinterpret it. Most of them could live without us, but it is doubtful whether we could live, eat, dream, or even think without them. As Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote, animals are good to think. And here we have some flamingos and migratory birds at Eilat in Israel. We are now, in the modern period, in the first world, in many parts of the world, alienated from our non-human family. Henri Beston, the naturalist, wrote, "We need another and perhaps more mystical concept of animals. We patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves. And therein we err, and greatly err. For the animal shall not be measured by man. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or have never attained, living by voices we shall never hear." And I think this is a diagnosis that might be necessary before we can approach these vessels. So perhaps it's natural that our ancestors wanted to drink from their heads, the bodily homes of their alien, yet strangely parallel minds, the places of their faces, the source of their gaze. To drink from an animal's head, as Robert mentioned, is to absorb its nature, to control its autonomous power. And perhaps, through the flowing liquid it channeled, it is also, I would suggest, perhaps to re-merge both minds in some way. Historically, we human animals have expressed this intense preoccupation with non-human animals by representing, manipulating, and curating their bodies, certainly in life, but even more in death. Because the animal-shaped vessel is not an animal's head, even if that was once its heritage, but instead recreates it, as we see here in this beautiful cup, again part of the exhibit, with the forepart of a lion, Chinese from the Sui dynasty, porcelain, beautiful cup, which is very much a highly culturally inflected product, one that is made out of non-animate materials like terracotta, soapstone, or precious metals. And it's really natural to wonder whether these cups and flasks have lost any meaningful relationship to the actual creature. If the modern house pet is, as the psychologist James Hillman complained, a little freak, drained of all wildness and divorced from its real habitus as animal, is it any longer a creature of anima, the source etymologically of its name in English, anima, soul in Latin? Perhaps the ancient 6th century Chinese porcelain cup with the head and paws of a young fantasy lion has as little to do with real Asiatic lions as the pink pig China salt and pepper shakers that my daughter was given last Christmas have to do with the living pigs that she loves so much. And yet, it's hard not to notice that the artist was highly observant of the actual species around her. They were part of his environment, part of her family, part of perhaps his constant threat. Always they were attended to. Unlike how we comport ourselves, we are not always aware of the animals that are around us. To assume that animal-shaped vessels were merely stylized ware, bearing no relation to real living animals, I think would be a mistake. From prehistoric archaeological evidence emerge ideas and bodily practices that may shed light on the animal-shaped vessels of antiquity. And I think these practices were, again, as has been said, about profound human relationship to animals. I want to touch tonight on 4 of these ancestral ideas and practices, all of which originate in the Paleolithic period, the Stone Age period. First is representing and thereby reanimating animals. The second is portraying the animal individual by focusing on its head, a source of anima and power. The third is ritually manipulating the sacrificed or hunted animal's head or skull by setting it up as a guardian of a grave, a talisman above an altar, or a trophy in a hall or house. This manipulation is also achieved by drinking or pouring from it. The skull or head is a vital object that seems to stand for, or even, I would argue, in a sense, resurrect the whole once living creature. And throughout these phenomena, persistent across millennia, from the Stone Age lion man up to the modern mermaid, ran the pattern of intentionally conflating the animal with the human being in art or in composite burials. In the latter case, arranging actual animal and human bones in deliberate patterns, as we see in the Neolithic, to make new hybrid entities, therianthropic creatures, in order to create what the Greeks call chimera and the Germans call Mischwesen. Might this be one key to interpreting animal-shaped vessels? The head is a natural vessel, a deep container, lending itself easily to work as a drinking cup. In a sense, this adaptation has never stopped, from the oldest figured vessels up to the spirit animal and human-headed pottery story mugs and jugs of rural Georgia brought there by settlers who carry on the decorative faced Toby jug traditions of 17th through 19th century England. The Georgia versions clearly depict African black as well as European white faces, frogs, cats, fish, ghouls, and Santa. Children chose a bedtime story to hear each night by picking a favorite face jug, which held sweet water or moonshine for the storyteller to swig while relating a tale to a wakeful little one. I took this a couple of summers ago in Georgia, and these are made by Pat Shields and Janice Hall Shields, who are committed to recreating these mugs. But there's more to it. A person drinking or pouring from an animal-shaped vessel, itself linked to the real or mythological beast it portrays, links her own head to that head. He becomes temporarily fused through flowing liquid into one composite creature, one Mischwesen, head to head, part of a very long line of such creatures, perhaps since the Chauvet cave. And here we see one of the beautiful wall paintings of Chauvet, dated from 35,000 to 1,500 BCE, stampeding aurochs, horses, and rhinoceri. And this is in the Ardèche region in France, and very recently discovered. So evidence from the Upper Paleolithic period shows a human imperative to represent animals and there possibly to reanimate them. And we do have the small stone and ivory sculptures from caves in Germany, France, and Spain, particularly bears, but more spectacularly, massive mural programs such as this one of animal paintings deep within the earth, and of course the one that was discovered that's even older in Sulawesi, which is now tragically suffering from the results of the terrible earthquake and tsunami, 40,000 years old. In the Chauvet cave, fantastic paintings of animals thundered in herds or in hunting packs, the Urgnatian period artists, rendering them, including some that are now extinct, among them aurochs, woolly mammoths, lions, bears, rhinoceros, and wild horses. There's even a lone owl. Now, Harvard's Alexander Marshak convincingly argued that rather than trying to show multiple animals in motion, Paleolithic artists instead were trying to renew them by seasonally redrawing the outlines of their bodies, heads, and backs. In other words, that perhaps this majestic art, which seems so reduplicative, was a kind of regenerative magical activity, efficaciously restoring the herds that served as food. And often lines that pierce the bellies that were drawn over and again, I think, tend to support this idea, these stylized lines, perhaps representing arrows or javelin sticks, also found in other Stone Age sculpture and petroglyphs. Can hunting magic alone account for the fact that, as Paul Bahn has observed, predatory animals are just portrayed just as frequently as animals of prey in the cave? While one might stop short of calling these animals portraits of individuals, neither, I would argue, can one confidently call them generic. They're much too alive, much too uncannily particular. They're more like giant dynamic family movies. In other words, it doesn't seem to have been enough for our ancestors to see, hunt, consume, and kill animals in their landscapes. They also needed to depict them on the move with unimaginable skill and absolute care in areas of these caves so remote and dark as to be almost inaccessible, miles in some cases. These sanctuary-like recesses, it has been established, were also sometimes co-inhabited by bears. Many of my students like to suggest each time I teach this that the bears were the artists, and I let them. Non-human animals needed to make the animals they hunted and who hunted them run again across vast undulating walls the sun could not reach, canvases of stone that artists over 30 millennia ago could only see by torchlight. Through the wall paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira in Europe, and now through the oldest petroglyphs known to date, those of Sulawesi, as I mentioned, animals had somehow to be reanimated, that is, re-ensouled. When I mentioned portraying animal individuals, I mentioned a focus on the head, and I think, again, we are methodologically led astray if we focus only on animal skulls. Because what we know from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic is there was a very profound emphasis on the human skull, including through secondary burial and skull removal. These are plastered skulls from Tel Aswad in Syria around 6500 BC, so mid to late Neolithic. And they were photographed by Anna Belfer Cohen and Nigel Goring Morris, who are Israeli archaeologists who specialize in the Neolithic. So we have the dynamic heads and necks frequently emphasized in prehistoric sites. They often, interestingly, have, as you've seen, less defined lower torsos. Sometimes they lack them entirely. So there's a kind of animal portraiture emerging in the Upper Paleolithic, one that is not only remarkably attentive to the particularity of the animal, but is also, like the skulls later, cephalic, that is, centered on the head. And this perhaps anticipates the later view that the anima, the vital essence, was primarily or uniquely located in the heads of both animals and human beings. Throughout the Neolithic period, human skulls of certain individuals are secondarily removed from skeletons, interestingly not all skulls, but particular individuals, and set up separately in shrine-like, albeit interestingly inhabited rooms, painted in ochre or other distinct arrangements at Tel Aswad, Jericho, and so forth, at Kachatl where I worked. These skulls were clearly precious, and their arrangement in secondary burial of great importance. They were repositories of cultural memory, but much more. Some, especially those from the Levant, are actually replastered to restore the look of skin and given cowrie shells for eyes. The human skull, like the secondarily treated animal skull, is refigured as an unperished head, clothed again in flesh, given sight, made to live again, to see. And this remains a core belief in many modern religious traditions with ancient roots. For example, in the Yoruba metaphysical concept of the ori, or head, the embedded spark of insight or spiritual power and destiny, or in the Vodou Met-Tet, master of the head, the ruler guardian who intersects with the spiritual identity of the initiate in a physical potet, or head pot, for which she must care all the days of her life. It was probably no different with animals. Their heads signaled and contained their powers. Now, observing that the Cretan raita, the conical drinking horns that we've been discussing, have two openings, as Robert has pointed out, Jeremy McInerney compellingly argues that some of the examples found in Minoan palace contexts, may have been intended not only to depict individual sacrificed bulls as funerary portraits, but also to reenact and participate, perhaps, in their ritualized death agony. The blood of bull victims may have nourished and honored the dead, as in the partly Bronze Age Odyssey 11, where the dead, like Elpenor, need the blood of sacrificed animals to speak, to live again. And this, of course, is the iconic Peliquet in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, where Odysseus has sacrificed 2 black rams and at the entrance to the underworld. Elpenor rises from the ground line to ask for a burial. Odysseus has learned for the first time of his death falling off the roof of Circe's palace. I just want to point out the strong focus of the artists in this beautiful appliqué on the rams' heads, on the focus on the heads of the animals, one calf and one ram, and of the similar focus in some of the vessels in the exhibit, such as the one we see by the Triptolemus painter from around 480 BCE that Susanna has displayed. A very strong focus again on the head and on reanimation. We've mentioned the notion of the bull's head raiton as possibly recreating the sacrifice, whether with wine or blood. I think it's going to remain an open question. We've had a lot of clotting factor debates without meeting, and so yeah, we'll keep going with that. But in any event, such an animal-shaped vessel may have commemorated victims similar to the great spotted bull who lies bound here on an offering table painted in fresco on the Apulian sarcophagus, also from Crete, 2 centuries later. And I won't belabor this casket. It's very well known, but it's generally accepted as portraying complex funerary scenes of musical procession, bull sacrifice, and blood collection. Particularly the collection of the bull's blood into what might be conceived as an altar table of some kind, as well as a procession toward a shrine, possibly of the deceased. Here we have that depicted. And you can see the focus on Raita being carried on a larger vessel being emptied into an even bigger collecting vessel. Again, one might well assume that this, because of the previous collection being depicted here, might well revolve around the ritual manipulation of the blood of the sacrificed bull. The portraits, McKiernan argues, would have been, in other words, the portraits such as we saw in the beautiful bull's head raiton might have been individual portraits. They might have represented specific bulls, in other words. And these, he says, might have been the sacrifice of any gathering at which they were used. If such a gathering was the feast following a sacrifice at which the bull was consumed or its meat distributed, a formal libation from a vessel imitating the bull's head would have constituted a ritual reenactment of the bloodletting that began the sacrifice. And here we have this notion then of the Apulian sarcophagus scenes with the bull as a kind of centrifuge of energy for the ritual, sanctification for the living, and nourishment for the dead. So the human sacrificers would portray the animal victim, but what the portrait vessels might have done in funerary ritual was to reanimate and re-slaughter, in a sense, the bull by pouring a crimson liquid like blood or wine, filling the vessel and through the manipulation of the opening in the back of its neck, and then out of its mouth or out of its nostrils. And so that awe-inspiring scene of flowing or repeating the earlier scene of the bull's death would have also had the effect of controlling the power represented by his blood. In other words, reproducing it in a choreographed way, which much of ritual does. In all of these actions, there's not only mediation between human and animal categories, there's also a kind of interchangeability between them. We know now that this was explicitly articulated in the Mediterranean. For example, in ancient Israel and classical Greece, animals were offered instead of humans in a ritual grammar of substitution. And I think it's no accident that the human victim whose possible sacrifice might have been undertaken in response to a catastrophic earthquake at the Minoan site in Archanis in Crete, as argued in 1979 by its excavators, the Sakalarakis, was also bound in exactly the same way and on a table of pretty much the same height. The famous passage from Leviticus 17:11 comes to mind. To the Israelites, God offers a theological rationale for the blood sacrifice of animals to him, it is explicitly intended to stand for the expiation of sin through the offering of human blood. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I've given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement. Leviticus interestingly indicates that sacrificial animal blood is to be splashed by the high priest directly onto the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And numerous red figure Attic vase paintings, as we know, show animals decorated and brought to the altar in festive processions, quite similar to the Aya Triada scenes, and some likewise, through the use of added red paint, show the victim's blood splashed onto Olympian altars in the sacrificial aftermath. And, of course, Aeschylus is Agamemnon, Euripides Iphigenia, and perhaps if Joan Conley is right, some of the Parthenon friezes expose the fact that the human bride and the festive animal may originally have been interchangeable victims, both adorned, marched to the altar, and given to the gods. But the animal, especially the mighty one, bore the burden of standing in for the most powerful surety, which was always a human sacrifice. As for ritually manipulating animal heads, briefly, as vessels, as trophies, as grave guardians, in one corner or chamber of the Chauvet Cave, its discoverers found the upper skull of a bear on a raised boulder, surrounded by bear jawbones on the floor. The meaning of this has been contested. Was it a kind of altar? It was the original amateur speleologists who discovered it said it troubled them by its solemn particularity. Or was it, as Paul Bahn has suggested, a random arrangement by bored children? As if. In either case, it bears witness to the manipulation of dangerous animals after death, and perhaps to their curation in a kind of ongoing way. The skull, that remarkable set of interlocking bone plates that in so many species, including our own, makes a perfect drinking cup after it is finished holding a brain, has in fact been used this way from the Paleolithic on. Regarding the Upper Paleolithic skull cups found in Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, Sylvia Bella and his colleagues say, the act of collecting and modifying human body parts after the death of an individual for trophy or ritual use is well documented. The majority of modified human remains are cranial elements. As we hear from the Greek historian Herodotus, the Black Sea Scythians sawed off the skulls of their defeated enemies and even their feuding kith and kin, and they covered them with leather and lined them with gold if they were wealthy. In either case, the skull is used as a drinking cup. And this is in the Persian Wars. Cross-cultural evidence from Tibet and elsewhere makes this more of a global habit. The skull, which contains the brain, as we said earlier, of African and Afro-Caribbean traditions, is a symbol and an organizer of one's higher spiritual facilities. To prepare and set up the human or animal skull after its death, and here we see not only the use of aurochs guarding graves within domestic interiors, these obsessively whitewashed walls of Çatalhöyük, the Neolithic first city in Anatolia, which has now been partially excavated by Ian Hodder over a period of 25 years, were set with plaster bowls and calf skulls called bucrania, dangerously sharp herds intact. So both guarding the graves on the floor and also right above it, you will see a plastered bucrania, guarding the platform graves of those buried directly beneath the floors. And we do, of course, have later examples of that, such as in this bell crater, where Nike brings a bull to an altar. This beautiful Apulian vase from the 4th century, attributed to the Iliopersis painter, and you can see the bucrania filleted, set up above the altar. Walter Burkert has persuasively argued that this part of the custom of rebuilding the animal victim after sacrifice and feasting, the Greek anatithemi, was an attempt to, in a sense, resurrect the animal by laying out its bones, much as a forensic investigator must do, in order to let it live again, in order to continue to speak. In other words, both in a sense, re-killing the animal and re-animating it under human control and in ceremonially controlled spaces. Such silent witnesses to human triumph and ambivalence are recognizable to us to this day in the taxidermied heads of elks and bear and moose hanging in European and American hunting lodges, and even on the walls of the Harvard Faculty Club in New York City, where Theodore Roosevelt shot most of them. And I just want to remind us of the extraordinary feature that we saw in the New York Times over the summer, which looked at the work of José Luis Martín Moreau in Pamplona, who collects the 6 bulls a day that are run through the streets amid human runners and participants contesting with them. They are killed, as obviously are those who participate in bullfighting. And his job and his vocation, which he undertakes with enormous passion, is to recreate these bulls and to sell either the entire bull or, more often, the whole bull to the runner or the toreador who contested with it. And his work reminded me so much of our animal-headed vessels, and particularly of our beautiful Cretan raiton, that I wanted to share this with you. It is as though the bull lived again, and that is his goal. Finally, Mischwesen and metamorphosis. We won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that there is a notion of an earlier time, as one Inuit elder told ethnographer Knud Rasmussen in the early 20th century, when both people and animals lived on Earth. The person could become an animal if he wanted to, and an animal could become a human being. Sometimes they were people, and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. That was the time when words were like magic. The human yearning for metamorphosis into animal form, along with an insistence on imagining hybrid beings that are both, is as old as art itself. And in the deepest chamber of the Chauvet cave, drawn on a large limestone stalactite, hangs Venus the Sorcerer, a composite figure with a bison head, perhaps incorporating into itself a lioness with what appears to be a classic Venus, an exaggerated pubic triangle, which is found commonly in other figural art from the Stone Age on, and human legs. Again, this is in the furthest chamber, the most remote, in the back of the Chauvet cage. The Sorcerer is contemporaneous with Dr. Ebbinghaus's favorite piece of art, which is the wonderful Orientation Löwenmensch, the oldest known figurative art, the lion man, perhaps a lioness, carved of mammoth ivory at a rock shelter in Hollenstein-Stadtadel and discovered in 1939. Many bison-headed humans, like the figure at Chauvet and the Trois Frères cave, and a haunting companion figure from that cave, dancing in the midst of a throng of moving animals, would appear, as well as a similar figure from Dordogne. As a rule, the head of these earliest hybrids is animal and the body anthropoid. It's interesting. The heads are animal and the bodies are anthropoid. The human, perhaps a shamanic figure, has assumed animal consciousness or is possessed by a master. It's very hard to know how to interpret them. But by the Neolithic period, human animals, composites can be far more complex. And I mentioned the many examples of skeletons in which human bones are given. For example, in one late Natufian grave, the horns of a gazelle. One at Hattula, an old woman's skeleton is interconnected to a bucranian, and so forth. I just want to conclude with this beautiful revolving face pot from Çatalhöyük that I encountered in working there. It was discovered in 2006. It is, as site archaeologist Lynn Menschel writes, detailing human faces on two ends, parts of which form the image of an animal or a cattle bucrania on either side. And this is 3 different views of it. But by rotating this life-size head-shaped ceramic vessel in one's hands, the 3-dimensional human face in relief turns into the incised visage of a bull and back again into a person with the continued turning. But it is not a simple 2-sided designs. The bull's horns extend into the human side of the pot and frame the human face. The bull's ears are in the place where the humans would be. Whose ears are they? The head-shaped vessel suggests, as Ian Hodder observes, a conscious metaphorical link between human and bull heads. The 2 beings mutually constitute one another, in Menschel's words, but before metaphor, also quite literally flow into one another as the face pot is turned. The sharp horns that one might have taken from a cattle head at a feast and set up in a plaster skull in the floor in one's house to guard the sleeping dead below became, as one turned that pot, one's own recognizable face or the face of the cherished dead. And then, as the vessel continued to be revolved, it became a cattle head once more. The pot, a container of grains or fluids in the shape of both an animal and a human head, itself reflexively performed animal-human cultural fluidity. Are these animal-shaped vessels only cultural objects? As scholars have begun to reconsider the materiality of lived experience and to reassess what had been called animism in the lifeways of indigenous peoples, our materialist conception of the object as lifeless and peripheral to cultural activity has begun to implode. The overlapping spheres of feasting, of drinking, and pouring culturally signified liquids with animal-shaped vessels, pouring libations from them, or using in gift exchanges that consolidated or displayed power, emphasizes the ways in which the bodies, and especially the heads of animals, were charged in antiquity with millennia of accrued meanings. So we have an easy approach to them. We can see their subjugation. We can see the bull sacrificed, the donkey laden, the fox cornered and terrified by the pack of braying beagles. But we could also note that these vessels never lost their ancient resonance with the permeability of the boundaries between humans and animals. One might possess the animal by pouring water or wine into a cup in the shape of its head, but this meant that by drinking out of that cup, the water or wine flowed back out of the beast, back into the human who drank, in a way, its essence. The animal shape thus represented more than a whimsical aesthetic take on cup or vessel, more than an aesthetic comment on trophy skull. It also may have stood for a kind of human appropriation of the animal's vital essence through pouring into and drinking out of its resurrected head, thereby reanimating that life force in one's own body. Just remembering Marilyn Strathern's wonderful idea of distributed personhood, this did not separate animals from humans, but further inscribed their symbiosis with wine or water as the conveyor of shared identity. And I want to end by just bringing up the celebration we had in 2005 of the distinguished career of Susanna's predecessor, my doctoral advisor and mentor, David Gordon-Mitten, who's with us in the audience, a previous George M. A. Hanfman Curator of Ancient Art here at Harvard. And at that time, I suggested that David's first acquisition as curator in 1975, an archaic faience Arabalos in the shape of a hedgehog from Naucratis, might represent his totem animal. It was just such a delight to see so much hedgehog theme running through your talk, Robert. So I suggested it might be David's totem animal, his first purchase, the hedgehog, with its intense curiosity in new objects. So it has the other qualities, longevity and fertility, but it is intensely curious about new objects. So when I discovered a coffee mug in the shape of one to give to David for Christmas, I was delighted. Now he and the hedgehog could flow in and out of one another. So I think it's through this lens of symbiosis and intersubjectivity that we might be able to apprehend in at least one of its dimensions the animal-shaped vessel. It is one half of a fluid equation. The cups and drinking horns and raita in the form of lions and bulls and griffins that we see in this beautiful exhibition, as striking as they are missing their other halves to create the composite, multi-part therianthrope. They lack the corresponding human being who once drank from them, who poured into and out of them, who created, as Susanna Ebbinghaus and Robert Koehl have suggested, masks performance, human beings, momentarily becoming the animals portrayed. When that human drinker, now lost, is restored in the mind's eye, these vessels come to life, and we are reminded that we ourselves, body and anima, have always flowed in and out of beasts. Thank you.
My first question is to you both. We have seen such a wide variety of animals. And it makes me wonder, can we see favorites? And are there vessels, are there animals that keep recurring again and again for vessel shapes? And what might be the reason? I think there's a lot of mammals, for example. You're showing these beautiful birds reminded me that while we have bird-shaped pictures, they're actually not that frequent. So in the Bronze Age, for example, Robert, which animals keep?
Well, the funny thing is that since you mentioned birds, which is something that I really don't quite understand anything about them in the context of what we're talking about. In the Minoan world, it's certainly bulls, but then in the early stages, it was equal numbers of birds, and birds were really common. Birds sort of drop out, bulls continue, and then they just expand the repertoire to include lions, of course, and fish in the Mycenaean world. Even we have big fish rhyton, and of course the hedgehog, and so there really is quite a range. But of course there must be animals, even dogs. We have dog rhyta, not that common, but they exist. Just trying to go through my catalog now, and the bull is, of course, the favorite, and always the favorite, whether it's the bull head or the full bull body. But as I say, then there are others as well. Quite a few. The dogs, I don't know. I mean, in the connection of sacrifice. We know that the Hittites sacrificed dogs. There's this Hittite ritual where they would cut a puppy in half and the army would march on either side of the puppy.
As one does.
Yes, of course. I'll go home and do that to mine. But otherwise, I don't know how the dog fits into this, since they're just, in terms of symbiotic relationships, nothing has a closer relationship to humans than dogs. And interestingly, with the dog rhyta, it's their heads too. It is the dog head and not the full body. We don't have many, but there are about 4.
Yeah, and I'm also struck by the ways in which, and I may be wrong, you'll correct me, Robert, but it seems as though most of them are animals that would have been in some ways domesticated or semi-domesticated. We don't have a lot of wild animals depicted in these drinking cups. Is that?
Except the lions.
Except for the lions, that's right.
And they're pretty big.
What, sorry?
They're pretty important.
And the lions are important as symbols of power. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
To what extent, I was just struck by your talk, Kimberly, it's almost as if the relationship to these animals that is expressed in the vessels is in some way paradoxical. Because in a way you do control the animal. The relationship seems to be antagonistic at first. You need to obtain that skull, or you at least recall the skull, or an act of sacrifice, or an act of warfare, as with lion head vessels, for example, that might show the power of a king. But then again, you also showed very convincingly how there's this confluence in a way.
Right.
So do you think there is an act of violence involved, or there is antagonism involved necessarily? I should say that a lot of explanations of animal-shaped vessels always say, oh yes, these were the same animals that were sacrificed. Drinking from an animal head cup, or even from the full body of an animal, recalls an act of sacrifice. This is really the most common.
Yeah, but donkeys weren't sacrificed, for example. I find that explanation pretty limited, and I think it's much bigger and more has to do with relationship. But as you said, there's this notion of, reanimating the animal and then reestablishing relationship through this very intimate act of drinking, of exchanging fluid, essentially. And so Burkhardt argued that there was so much ambivalence about violence, whether hunting or in sacrifice, that it was, in a sense, highly ceremonialized, highly choreographed. I don't know. In some ways, I think he was right. In other ways, I'm not sure. I think, as moderns, we have perhaps much more ambivalence. We don't kill the animals we eat. We see other people kill them in abattoirs, and we buy them wrapped and so forth. But there definitely was, as you said, this kind of ritual effort to revivify the animal and then to commune with it. I think that's why I say that when we realize that the vessels are missing their other half, I think they become more intelligible. At least that's how I see it, because they're missing the person drinking.
So you think that the vessels, in a sense, express both that sort of ambivalence that humans felt towards both sacrificing domesticating, depending on them, yet killing them, and by drinking out of them, in a sense, it almost expiates the guilt that one feels for.
I'm not even sure it's that clear, Robert, because, again, with an animal like a donkey, they wouldn't have been sacrificed or hunted, and yet we have all these donkey cubs,
Right.
which, as Susanna brilliantly pointed out, turned the person drinking as he became more drunk into a donkey,
Right.
and the extended neck would have been leveled out, and that's what donkeys do when they bray. Yeah. So, which sort of points to the way in which these cups are animate. They were meant to be. They are understood as part of an interactive process. But with the donkey and animals like that, you don't have them being killed or hunted.
What about the birds? I mean, at Kultepe, there's so many birds of prey, eagles, and I mean, that's one of the prominent birds that we find, both the head of the bird and the full body.
Right, and then you have these really interesting, I worked with Professor Vermeule on these actually when I first came, on these strange composite pots that you find at, for example, at Hisarlik and other sites, Bronze Age, which have breasts and they have owl faces. And you find that actually it's very ubiquitous, Upper Neolithic and Bronze Age. And what are those all about? But an obsession with, again, a kind of mixing of bird and human features within the vessel. Yeah.
I actually had one question for you, Robert, and that is, you have shown these other types of writer that are non-figural, that are conical or piriform, which essentially means pear-shaped, but they kind of follow the same typology as the animal-shaped vessels. So can we actually see a difference in their context of use, or in their? Do you think were they used for the same purposes? Or?
Well, one of the things that I think about with the Minoans is that nothing ever has just one function.
Right.
And that something that, depending on the context, if it's in a context that clearly seems to be a ritual religious context, then it may have been used in that case. But they're so practical in other senses that they could also have just been like the conical ones. Some of them are beautiful and made out of stone and metal, and others are made out of clay, and yet well, here's the other thing too. The Minoans seem to have had this habit of what I call making cult repositories. In other words, they would place, and it's generally exclusively Raita, in one room, so that there are places like at Gurnia, for example, in Palais-Castro, where there are 16 Raita, and they come in pairs very often, and then one bull, so that the bull does sort of stand alone. And then we do find bull Raita, like I showed on the lustral basin from Festos, and the famous bull's head from the little palace at Knossos, and there are other sporadic occurrences at Zakros, for example, where there's also a wonderful treasury or cult repository with lots and lots of Raita, but there's one bull, and it was not found in the cult repository. It was found fallen from the upper floor into a lustral basin. So it's not clear, it's not clear, because as I say, at Gurnia at least we do have the bull head stored with the other Raita, but yet we also find them without the Raita. So that I suspect that with the pairs of Raita, they were probably carried in processions. Maybe the bull was also part of the processions, but then I suspect that there must have been occasions when bull Raita were needed and the conical Raita weren't needed. And it might also have to do with the number of people involved, because in these cult repositories it does seem to suggest groups of people, whereas when we find just a single bull, it might have just been one person, or I think it needs two actually to fill a bull Raita. Somebody holding the horns and submerging it, and the other person sort of gripping it underneath the chin and closing the top. I don't have a good answer.
If you just wish there was a representation that would survive, or maybe two or three of them to be safe.
Yes.
But
there is only, and there's the one representation of the conical Raiton from the procession fresco at Knossos, which suggests,
really
of course, that they were. It's great. Thank God we have that. At least that sort of certifies the fact that they were carried in processions, and not just surmising it from the distribution and context. But no bullhead Raita depicted, although we do have bullhead Raita in Linear A and Linear B, that they were valuable enough that they were being recorded, that they were being, and even the fact that they were metal ones, that does occur in the tablets, whereas there are no other Raita that are mentioned in any of the tablets. That's just because we have few tablets, I suppose. But the fact is that, considering that we have so few tablets, it's interesting that we do have bull Raita, and it's this type, like the Little Palace one, that appear on the tablets. So they must have been valuable, at least in terms of their metal worth.
Yeah.
Which seems to be the case too when they were given as diplomatic gifts. You know, when Tupac gives one to the Pharaoh of Egypt, he's talking about, well, it weighs 5 minas, you know, and so they're really impressed with the weight of these things. So, in a sense, too, at least from a diplomatic point of view, it may have been just the intrinsic value of the metal that was so appealing. I think that, you know, the meaning and just is very fluid and changes with different cultures and different, you know, historical circumstances.
But I think both of what you both have said really points to the importance of trying to imagine the people in the picture too.
Yeah.
The people who were handling these vessels, the people who were drinking from them, completing kind of the spectacle of using them.
Spectacle it is. That's nice.
So yeah, are there questions from the audience? We do have microphones. Yes, Matthew? Oh. No.
I assume, right, they were used for wine, like for alcoholic beverages or not?
Excuse me?
Did the writer, these vessels, were they used for wine, alcoholic beverages, or not necessarily?
We like to assume that, but we don't have any analysis that's been done of the residue from the interior that would really tell us for sure. So, you know, one of the things that Kimberly and I have not quite debated, but talked about in exchange is whether they had blood inside of them. And that's something that I have kind of been hesitant to suggest because the opening is so small. It's a hot climate, blood coagulates really fast, and I can't imagine how the blood would ever exit through the half-centimeter diameter of a rhyton unless it were mixed with wine.
Unless it was
and
done
it could
right
be diluted.
away. Unless it was done right away.
Right, or done right away.
Right.
But even then, it comes out kind of thick, and just to, by the time you get the blood from the head of the bull into the rhyton, because you have to, if you're filling a rhyton from that tip, by the time the blood gets from the bucket, as we see on the bucket vases of the Ayutthaya sarcophagus, to then put a rhyton in it, by that point, in that hot Mediterranean sun, it's really thick, and it's, I can't see
Unless
it.
they're inside and in a dark place, which as we know, Knossos has many.
That's possible too.
Yeah, okay. So
And
we like to
we
talk
do
about this, it's
have-
fun.
And we do have some written sources actually for the Bibru, for the Hittite vessels. Oh, actually they don't specify what was drunk either.
No, they just say they're
doesn't-
drinking vessels.
Yeah.
Drinking.
They could have been
Yeah,
beer.
it's
It's the Hittite world.
Yeah.
For all we know, they were drinking beer out of them.
Well,
So-
beer, well, alcohol anyway. I was just
Fermented
wondering
beverage.
if this has anything to do with the metamorphosis idea you were talking about. So when people consume alcohol, they let go of their, you know, human personalities and their basic instincts come forward and they become more like
Yeah, as we've
animals,
heard
you
about
know?
too much this
Can
week,
can this be why the animal shapes were so popular for the drinking vessels, not ritualistic vessels, but
Well, yeah, right, and drinking vessels might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
we assume that these special shapes probably also had a special
Right.
content,
Right.
and that the alcohol was really our speaker for the opening night, Michael Dietler, quoted somebody in the African world saying, you know, if there is no beer, it's not a ritual. It's special beverages plus special vessels that make drinking occasions special. And what you say about, yes, transforming drinkers, that is something, for example, that one can see in the later Greek vessels that Professor Patton mentioned, the donkey head cups, that very clearly is talking about human behavior under the influence, so to speak. But then coming under the influence of the wine god, who was connected with donkeys. So,
And transformation.
yeah, absolutely.
It's sort of another symbiotic relationship there between the beverage and the
Right.
effects on the person and the vessel, and all sort of this nexus of,
Exactly.
of transformation.
It's a
and
context of many different players, and it's an energetic one. Yeah.
thank you.
Have other questions? Yeah.
Me? My turn?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wonder if I can add a little bit view from the East. I've been chasing after the bullhead for a long time, but in another aspect, I compare ancient symbols and writings, you know. So in Chinese, actually, because at the beginning I was chasing after why A is leading the alphabetical cycle, and then for the last 20 years I've been going after that, and I have to tell you something very strange. In ancient Chinese writing, the oracle bones, we have tons of A symbols. Whenever you see the A, it represents the soul, the mind, the unseen energy. And there is a very precisely a little piglet, and there is actually an A sign written inside it, you know, or right next to it, you know, it varies. And it gives the soul or the energy to that little thing, you know, whatever that animal is, and it merges with that animal, and it becomes the brain also, the conscious, and I can see the development of all these. And also when I bring it back to Sumerian in the last couple of years, it's very interesting. Whenever I see the A, is always to do with the either the bull. In English, I think you still have the word auroch.
Auroch, yeah.
Maintain there, symbolizing the bull. And in Cantonese, actually, it's still owl. And in Telugu, in Indic language, it's also ngao. And this is the vowel sign. And then the other sign will be the cattle side, the K side. And that will be still, you can still find them in the car in ancient Egyptian as the bullhead. And I mean, they interchange backward and forward.
Right.
I do think that, you know, if we want to see the whole picture, other than the artifact, we have to also look into the writing aspect,
Right.
and also the sound aspect.
Right.
And as you see, all these words like actor, action, everything, you need the soul, you need a thought to be able to move. And also it become actually grammar. The R become the movement towards something. So it's a very complete picture. So I'm just saying that maybe we add all the complete aspects, you know, into the whole research. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think, so to still give you some time to actually explore the galleries, maybe we should end here with this reminder really that this is a topic that still, there's a lot of areas still to investigate. I also wanted to say that for those of you who would like to learn more, our shop is actually open, and you can tonight acquire the catalog with a 10% discount. So thank you very much for coming, and a big thank you again to our speakers.
You can applaud.